Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Let's give a couple of minutes for some other people to connect, and then we shall start. Looking forward to have a great session today with Colleen.
I see Jeff is here from the last time.
Oh,
Yes.
cool.
Hey, Jeff.
Hey.
Hey.
It's a familiar face. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Colleen, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Thought,
Nice.
I got to see Colleen speak, so I thought I'd definitely have to join this morning.
Yeah, our network is growing.
We wait one more minute, Patrick, and then we start.
Yeah, let's wait for one more minute for some people to connect. We have already 22% connected so far. Reminding you that the session is being recorded and will be shared afterwards through our usual channels.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Okay, 25% connected. Let's start. Good afternoon again, everyone. Welcome to our third meetup of Agile Mauritius. I'm Patrick, one of the members of Agile Mauritius. And before we start today, I would like to introduce you to the Agile Mauritius user group, especially for the new joiners. We launched at the start of April and had our first event on 29th of April. Our second one was on 8th June with Jeff and Chad. And the objective of the Agile Mauritius is to grow the Agile community in Mauritius. We are here to connect the Agilists and to network, share, and learn from each other. This meetup is for everyone interested in business agility, and we are present on LinkedIn, Meetup, and YouTube. I will be sharing the links. Actor, can you paste the link in the chat, please?
Yeah, sure, I'll do that.
Okay, and you can subscribe to the channel Agile Mauritius. You will find all the past events on this platform that you can refer to. So that was a quick introduction to the group. Today, I will be coordinating with Actor, another member of Agile Mauritius, and he will shortly introduce himself. Before we proceed, some quick guidelines for those who just joined. Kindly ensure that you're on mute and when the speakers will be talking. We'll try to keep like 15-20 minutes for the Q&A after the talk. And if you have any questions at any time during the meetup, just send it in the chat window, please. And lastly, last reminder that the session is being recorded and will be shared afterwards. And if you have any question about on this session or anything else, we are here to assist you. I will now hand over to Actor. We'll introduce today's event and speaker. Over to you, Actor.
Thank you, Patrick. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So good evening to you all, and good morning, especially to Colleen. I know it is still sunrise in the USA. So hi, Colleen.
Hi, Actor.
So I am Actor, one of the members of Agile Mauritius, and I am sure you do not want to hear more about me, especially at this late hour in Mauritius. So let me introduce you to our speaker. So Colleen Johnson. Colleen is the CEO and co-founder of Scattersport, a space for actionable retrospectives, and CEO of ProKanban.org, an inclusive Kanban learning community. She has presented and taught Agile to audiences around the world. As a coach, she has worked with clients across a range of industries, including Wells Fargo, Home Depot, Salesforce, Tanium, Gemini, and more. Colleen helps organizations apply a systems thinking approach to aligning Agile methodologies end-to-end. She has served as board member for Agile Denver, the Agile Uprising, and chair of Mile High Agile Conference. She's happiest in the woods, camping with her 3 kids and very patient husband. Today, the talk will be on learning Kanban basics. And without any further delay, I pass over to you, Colleen, who will talk more on the topic. You can go ahead, Colleen. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. Well, I wish I could be there in person. It looks beautiful where you live. And, you know, I was thinking, I don't know if they do this at university there, but at the universities in the US, there's exchange programs where you can pay your tuition and then go to a different school. So if we want to set something up with Mauritius and Denver where we could have an Agile exchange program, I will volunteer first to give somebody my desk here so that I can come work for
Most welcome. Most welcome.
All right, well, let's go ahead and talk Kanban. We're going to keep this pretty high level today and just walk through some of the core concepts. We're going to take a little bit of time to play a game. It's a game that can be run a lot longer. Jeff, this will be familiar for you. I just want to give everybody a chance to get their hands dirty and play around actually doing Kanban. So we'll use this game briefly to give you a chance to get familiar with it and try it out. And then the game is online. So if you love this and you want to try it again, play it into the evening or take it back and play it with your teams. That game's accessible to you online, so you can try it and play it for longer. Since today will be kind of a short preview of that. Let me go ahead and switch this. Do you guys see the full view now?
It's coming.
Maybe.
Yeah, it's good now.
All right, so let's talk Kanban. When we think about Kanban, there's a couple of things that we're trying to do for our teams. We're trying to reduce context switching. Harold, I think when you joined, or you said you weren't very good at multitasking, but guess what? None of us are. No one's really that good at multitasking. So our goal when we start to bring Kanban to the team is how do we help the team have clear focus, understand their priorities, and really reduce all that context shifting and switching that happens day to day for everybody at work. We're trying to help the teams deliver with predictability. And, when I first started out with Kanban, this was the thing that got my attention the most quickly about Kanban. If we could get away from having to spend all this time estimating work and then being wrong about the estimate and then beating the team up for being wrong about the estimate, I wanted to be able to shift to a way where we were able to forecast with a lot more confidence with data and making it just a lot easier for the team. So we'll talk a little bit about how Kanban can help with that. And then, I think one of the things that Kanban really shines at is this last one here, and that's creating slack in your system so that you can absorb unplanned work, have time for innovation. I think we have a tendency to build out our week and our day, looking at 100% capacity, right? Like, how do I fill every minute? And if we're always operating at 100% capacity, we're probably really operating at like 110% capacity in that case, right? Because we're just packing everything in, and it makes it hard to have any time in your day or your week to think, to learn. And so we want to try to figure out how to create some slack for our teams so that time is there for them. Kanban has 2 meanings. And when we think about Kanban, if you've ever used Jira, which I'm sure you've had the pleasure, then for a lot of us, when we think Kanban, we think of a Kanban board. And that is one part of Kanban, a large visual board. But the other piece of Kanban means signal card. And when we say signal card, what we mean by that is a signal that you have capacity to do more work. And so when I'll try to give you a lot of examples here of different Kanban things that we see in everyday life. One of the things when I think of a signal card is like if you have to go to anywhere where you pull the little ticket number down, and then there's the large board that calls your number up when you've been waiting in line, that's a signal of capacity that it's your turn. Or in like parking garages, sometimes they'll have lights over the parking spaces that are open to tell you which row to drive down. So you don't have to drive up and down all the parking garage spots to find an open spot. And so that signal of capacity is just as important as the large visual board piece when we think about Kanban. And we throttle our capacity through these work in progress limits, or WIP limits, that we'll look at here in a little bit. Let's see. Ah. The slide went too far ahead. Give me 1 second. There we go. Kanban has 3 main practices. The first is defining and visualizing a workflow. The second is actively managing items in the workflow. And 3 is improving the workflow. And we'll go through each of these in more detail. Okay, number 1. So number 1 is define and visualize your workflow. What's really important when we think about our workflow here, and when we say workflow, we're thinking of the stages that your board goes through. So think of your columns on your board. This can be as simple as to do, in progress, and done. Sometimes it can be, I've seen teams with like 7 columns on their board, right? But you want to think through the process that your work goes through to be completed. We have a tendency, and I'm going to blame Jira for this too, but we have a tendency to think of these columns as roles. So like a development role, a QA role, and then maybe a deployment role. And what we really want to try to shift to is what activities have to take place at each stage. We want to avoid those roles. We want to avoid handoffs. And we want to avoid having holding places on our board where work is sitting and no work is actually taking place. When you think of these holding tanks or buffer states in your board, they tend to be all of the ready to, like ready to test, ready to dev, ready to, ready for deployment. Anything that starts with that ready to state is often a place where we push work and then it just piles up in that spot. So we want to try to keep our board focused on the activities that take place. And in some cases that might mean that you have tickets, like your ticket may span 2 columns, right? And we'll look at a few examples of that. We also don't want to copy anyone else's Kanban board here. So your flow of your work should be unique to your team. That's not always super easy depending on the tooling that you use and how you're reporting out, but this is one thing I think that Jira shines at. So one of the things you can do with Jira is have a pretty generic workflow, and then each team's board can be slightly different where the workflows map up to those states. And there are a lot of other tools available that are not Jira, that are more specific to Kanban. But I know that Jira is the one I run into the most with all of my clients. So I usually try to talk a little bit to how to apply Jira's tool to Kanban. Okay, so this part really is just a board. So we have our board, we figured out what our workflow is, what stages each ticket's going to go through, and then we want to figure out how we add that visualization of capacity. So once you have your workflow and your work on the board, the next part is going to be what type of work moves through the system. And so these can also vary from team to team, but we really want to dig into what type of requests come to our team. The most common ones from a development perspective are often things like technical debt, user stories, production defects, but this will be different depending on what kind of work your team does. I've been doing a lot of work more recently with security teams, and they have a very different list of work item types that they're dealing with. When I'm trying to break out work item types, and I worked with a marketing team once that when they tried to outline all of the different types of work they did, they had like 80 different work item types. You probably don't want that many. But one of the things I like to think of for work item types and trying to figure out how much to slice these up and how many different work item types to have is how you will measure them. So we'll talk a little bit here about flow metrics, but looking at the work item type examples that I have listed here, we might want to say, technical debt usually takes us 4 days, user stories usually take us 5 days, and prod defects usually take us 1 day. So we start to break out our cycle time or estimated time for these different items based on the work item type. And that can help you decide if it needs to be a separate work item type or if it would all roll up under the same work item type. We want to try to avoid having classes of service. And there's, I think that this is a debate in the Kanban community. Jeff, I'm sure you've heard this one too. When we talk about expedited, I think that for new teams, expedited always feels like a great way to manage expectations externally. But what often happens is you have a separate lane on your board for expedited items, and then it's just always full. And so you've created kind of a different channel of work through your board that's always going to take higher priority than the work that's prioritized in your board. So one of the things that we want to look at with all of these different types of work on that's moving across our Kanban board is reprioritizing things in every column, possibly every day. So we'll look at some different indicators or different things to help the team organize around the work. Again, another thing that really just depends on the tool that you're using is how to visualize some of the things on your board. So card color, swim lanes, dots. We don't get to have fun physical boards at the moment, but I think you can have a lot of fun creating physical Kanban boards too, where you have a lot of different visualization through things like this. Kanban has all these great sayings. I feel like we need like a Kanban sticker pack, but one of my favorites is manage the work, not the people. And we'll talk a little bit about how this shifts how you're doing stand-ups. So, I think one of the patterns we get into with stand-ups, whether you're a Scrum team or a Kanban team, is that we do a round robin status, right? So I'll tell you, what did I do yesterday? What am I working on today? And do I have any blockers? And one of the things that's important as we shift to Kanban is we want to talk about the work on the board rather than each person's updates at stand up. So we'll walk the board from right to left, looking at each ticket on the board. In some cases, there might not be any update, but we're looking to how do we organize around this work? So if I have capacity, let's say I finished something this morning, and I am ready to pick up something new. My conversation with the team is going to be about what work is closest to finishing and how do I contribute to getting that something over the, getting something close to finishing over to the done column instead of starting something new, which is easier said than done. I think it's very hard to kind of rewire our brain to focus on getting work over that finish line instead of pulling in new work. We always want to go start something new and exciting. And we'll look at some tips here for having great Kanban stand-ups. Number 2 is manage flow. And one of the things I think that's so interesting with Kanban teams, I see a lot of teams where dates get set for a project or a milestone or an initiative. And one of the things I hear the teams say almost immediately is that they have no control over hitting that date. Maybe even if they've set the date, they don't feel like they have the ability to steer their work in a way, the date's fixed, the scope is fixed, now the time is fixed. So they struggle to figure out how they have any control over their success. When we talk about managing flow, it's important that we're giving the team the information to be able to organize around that work. So we'll look at things like target cycle time, or this is also referred to as a service level expectation or service level agreement. When we talk about a service level expectation, I feel like that can sound a little heavy to a team. So I like to go in with target cycle time just so it's a little bit looser for them. And when I say target cycle time, if we go back to that concept with the user story of saying, 85% of our user stories get done in 5 days or less, I've just given the team something to organize around. So work that's on my board that's starting to age past that 5-day target gives us something to organize around. And then as a team, we can start to say, this ticket has been in progress for 7 days. How do we bring some attention to getting it over the finish line? If you've forecasted using data like that off your past performance, then this also helps you see if your trends are going up and things are starting to take longer, scope has to come out to keep that date, right? Or the date moves if scope stays the same. So you're starting to figure out what are all the pieces that the team has control over here in managing work against that target cycle time. This is where we also always want to look at how do we get something over the finish line instead of starting new work, and amplify blockers in the system. Blockers are always one of the most interesting things, I think from just our human nature. The minute we get stuck with something, we want to go pull something new in so that we can stay busy and stay active. But when we do that, we're actually kind of covering up opportunities to fix things in our system or potentially even in our organization. I'll hear teams say a lot, you want me to stop working? Are you telling me if I get blocked, you want me to stop working? And I usually tell them, yes, I do, because if there's something that's blocking you, and you figure out how to just keep working so that you stay busy, we are not addressing the underlying problem of what got you blocked. And we don't know that there's a problem there that needs fixed if you appear to be consistently busy. So how do we amplify those blockers so that we can resolve them? And then the other part of managing flow is looking at priority every day. So do we have anybody in a product role? I'm not sure if we've got any product owners. When we think about how your product role shifts in a Kanban team, you know, when we're working in Scrum, we're working in batches, right? Small batches of 2 weeks worth of work, or maybe 3, depending on the length of your sprint. But we're prioritizing work, bringing that work to the team, and then going back to reprioritize the next batch of work. I think one of the things that surprises a lot of product folks is how much your role shifts with a Kanban team to doing that every single day. So you're doing it for less work, maybe 1 or 2 tickets each day, but every day you're going back to say, what's the next highest priority coming to the team today? And is that work ready for them to pull? So when we think about how we incorporate the signal of capacity into our board, you'll see numbers at the top of each column here, and these are our work in progress or WIP limits. So this is telling me how many cards can be in each column at any given time based on the capacity of this team to do each of these activities. So if this gray card in the development column is done, I cannot push it to the code review column because it's already at its capacity. So as a team, we would want to say, what on this board is close to finishing or is close to moving to the next stage of the workflow so that we can focus on creating some capacity for the start gray card to move. So we might as a team say this yellow card in QA is the one that's the closest to finishing. So maybe we could have somebody help us get this one into deploy so that everything else can shift to the right. There's a lot of Kanban practice comes from lean manufacturing and Toyota production systems. And on the manufacturing floors, there's a cord that runs the length of the floor called the andon cord. And the andon cord is something where if let's say we're making toothpaste lids, right? And the toothpaste lids are coming out of the conveyor belt and all of a sudden we go to put one on and the threads are missing from the cap. You can pull that andon cord and the whole manufacturing line will stop. So you don't keep making toothpaste lids that won't work. So when we think about this, you want to have that same kind of tension in your Kanban board where when there's a blocker or when there's an issue, you can pull that andon cord and everybody comes together to take action to remove that blocker or to help move that work downstream. When we think about the other part of managing flow here, it's where the aging work, visibility into the age of the items on your board becomes super important. We want to always be looking at first in, first out, or how do we manage getting that work done? And think of anything that's on your board that's aging is becoming a risk to your team, right? The code's getting older. You maybe haven't deployed it, you haven't tested it yet. So all of the age of the work on our board starts to become kind of a liability for our teams. And we want to focus on how do we bring visibility, not just to the age, but into how our team will organize around that work that's aging. Jira has little dots at the bottom of the cards that show you aging work. I don't love them. They're not very tangible and you can end up with your whole board covered in dots and still not really have any action around it. If you are in a shop that uses Jira, I like to create filters where you can create some custom filters off of a number of days in progress. And that gives you some options. I usually call it something like stale stories or aging work. And then you can hit that filter and see anything on your board that's over a certain number of days. The other piece that's important about your aging work is that you have a plan for how to address it. I see a lot of teams that they have all these colors and lights on their board that tell them that work is old, but it's still all just sitting there. So you want to have kind of a call to action for your team of what happens when we approach that service level number. So number 3 is improve your workflow. Just like you would with a Scrum team, we want to do retrospectives and review metrics as part of those retrospectives. Your Kanban system's never really done. And so you want to keep coming back to this and trying new things. I like to look at them all as like very small experiments. So as a team, you might say, we feel like we want to try increasing the total WIP in our system, the total number of work items in progress, to see if our cycle time stays consistent, but we can improve our throughput. So you might try that for 2 weeks and come back and say, that didn't help us. We're actually going to lower it back down. Another thing that I do a lot with teams is moving things, whether or not they should be exit policies or columns on the board. Code review is a great one, right? Code review could be part of your development column, but you might see that that step often is the blocker in getting work to move. Nobody wants to do the code review, so they sit there. So pulling that out and making that a separate column on your board might draw some attention to the activity and give you the ability to measure how much time it's taking to do that particular step. And it's okay. You can pull that column out for a little while, move it back in if it gets better. So you want to constantly be tweaking your workflow to fit the needs of the team and the work that moves. We've talked a little bit about flow metrics, and this is just a preview. I mean, we're actually Pro Kanban's about to launch a whole course around metrics. I'm super excited about it. But the 4 main metrics that we want to focus in here on are WIP, and that's the total WIP for your system, not the sum of your WIP limits. So it may go up and down from time to time if you're breaking your WIP or you're not hitting the total number. But this would be the total number of items on your board that have started and not been completed. Throughput, which is just a raw count for a period of time of how many items got done. And you might break this out by work type. So you might say our throughput was, for the last 2 weeks, was 5 user stories and 5 production defects. And then work item age, and that's the time that has gone by since you started a work item that is not yet completed. And then cycle time. So that is when a work item is done, how long did it take us to complete that work item? And when we think about these 4 numbers, 2 of these are leading indicators and 2 of these are lagging indicators. So WIP and work item age are something, those are our numbers that are for the work that is currently in flight. So how much work we have and how old it is on the board is work not delivered yet. So that's a leading indicator. Throughput and cycle time are going to be a lagging indicator because that work is done. So the count of items done and the cycle time metric are on work that is done. So when we think about what levers we have as a team to pull to take action on things, it's going to be on those 2 leading indicators, right? So on how much work is in flight and how old it is on our board. And that's going to drive our ability to really impact our throughput and our cycle time. This is a screenshot from Actionable Agile. Some of you may be familiar with this, and this is a way for us to view some of this data. You can, if you are using Jira, there's plugins that will sit on top of your Jira data and pull this out for you. And this is giving us a snapshot of cycle time, our total items and work in progress, the Monte Carlo simulations to help you forecast your completion based on your current cycle time. And then here at the bottom, we have our system stability. And this is how we get super predictable, is by really seeing this system stability start to level out. When we think about arrival rate and throughput rate here, arrival rate is the number of tickets that come in each day. Throughput is the number of tickets leaving. And then WIP age is for the work currently on the board, what's the average age of those tickets. And you can see for this particular team in this screenshot, the WIP age is going way up. So as a team, we might not be doing a great job of managing around our work item age. The other thing we want to look for with our stability here is that our arrival rate isn't really outstripping our throughput rate. And so when you think of arrivals and throughput, think of the airport. That's the best example I can think of when I think of arrivals and departures. And think of if you've ever flown somewhere and you've landed on the runway for wherever you're getting to, and they say, well, there's no gate available for your plane to pull up to. We're just gonna have to sit here on the runway for a while. Your team in this case is that airport, and your capacity as a team is how many gates you have, right, in the airport. So if more planes are landing than are leaving, they're sitting on the runway somewhere. And so think of new work coming to your team in that sense, right? So if more work is coming in and it's not leaving, it's just building up in the system somewhere and aging. And chances are it's not active work, right? At that point, it's just sitting around. So we want to try to meter or throttle down how much work comes to the team to roughly equal that week's worth of, or whatever your throughput rate is, how you're measuring it. And that way we're keeping a consistent pace for the team of work coming in, work moving, and work leaving the team. One other thing that can be really important when we think of how to throttle our arrival rate is the type of work that your teams do. So I mentioned I've been working more frequently with security teams, and for them, the work that they do is very unpredictable. It's always urgent. Burnout is very high. So they keep their to-do column really low. They have a WIP limit on their to-do column and a max. So they might say our WIP limit for the to-do column is 3 items, but we always have one spot that's open for urgent unplanned work to move into. So it has a minimum and a maximum, like a minimum of 2, a maximum of 3. And that gives you that flexibility so that your arrival, there's always a space available for your arrival column. So our goal here is finding this stable flow of work coming in and work leaving, and a sustainable pace. So I mentioned, you know, I had no idea going into these last 2 years that security burnout is super high, and that those teams struggle to keep people not just in an organization, but in that role in general, because burnout is so high. And, you know, I think when you think about how work often moves through an organization, whether it's security or software development, I always say we want to avoid where we see piles coming, right? Like a pile growing, because at some point that snowball is going to hit someone else. And, you know, if we look at this traditional development flow, that often happens to QA first. So the development team might work as fast as they can, and they're creating this growing pile of work that then somebody downstream has to play catch up and work overtime or be very stressed out to try to keep pace with. And so think about how can we even that out so that we have a consistent pace of work moving through our teams and that we're not burning anybody out. And in some cases, that might mean that you stop doing work here, right? I started out cooking in restaurants before I ever got into IT. And there's signs all over the kitchens that say, if you can lean, you can clean. And I always like to think of that with my board, right? So, you know, you'll have developers that this will make them panic. They will not love the idea that they're going to stop working until QA can catch up. And I always tell them, it's not that you can't find something productive to do. I'm sure there's some way you can contribute to unit tests or code reviews, or help, you know, maybe jump over and help QA if possible. But the main thing I'm asking you to do is to not pull in new work. Because the more work we pull in, the more we're creating a bigger pile that we're still going to have to stress somebody else out to keep pace with. So think about that. If you can lean, you can clean. We'll find something to do that's productive, I promise. There's always something. Our goal here is always getting work over that finish line. And we want to keep bringing the team back to the fact that doing work is not as valuable as work that's done. So we want to shift our thinking to be more about getting work done instead of just keeping ourselves busy. Okay, we are going to play a quick game. I'm going to give you a preview of this. So this is something we play in our pro Kanban training classes, and this is called Twig, the whip game. And we're definitely not going to have time to play the whole thing, but I thought a couple days of trying it out would be interesting, and you'll see the number of days you have here. And your goal here is to optimize optimize your system to get the most number of cards into this done column. This is your lovely team here, and your red friends have the specialty of the red column. Blue is the specialty of the blue column, and green is the specialty of the green column here. However, you can use your team in any capacity on this board. So if I need to organize around maybe a blocker, I could use some of the blue and green people on my team to help remove that blocker. So they're not going to be as productive in areas outside of their specialty, but you can move them around. And this will work just like it would on your boards or in your system. So anything finished can go to the next column, and you just drag those around. And then you'll figure out how to organize your team. So you'll say, it looks like this card's 29 days old and has 4 boxes of work left to do on it. So I might say I'm going to put one person here and one person here, and I'll put one, and then blue is the second row, and that's showing me how much work is remaining on each ticket. And then maybe I'll put both people here. So we're going to do this in small groups. We'll set up breakout rooms, and I will drop this link here in the chat. And I'll jump around and make sure everybody is getting set up and moving. Let's see. And then once you're ready and you have everyone on your team assigned, you can hit begin work. And you'll see these boxes start to fill in. One of the questions I always hear is, how come they don't fill in consistently the same number of boxes every day? And I love that question, but the reason is we don't fill in the same number of boxes every day, right? There's variability in our day that we can't plan for. Sick kids, meetings, trainings, all these different things that might take place in your day that make your output inconsistent. And so the game is meant to reflect that same variability in how much work gets completed. You'll see your WIP limits here across the top, and we'll go ahead and play. Let's play for 15 minutes, and then I'll pull everybody back. Like I said, that won't give you enough time to play the whole game, but we'll give you a chance to see some of the mechanics, and then we'll come back together and talk about how it's going. So you'll just do the same thing on the second day. You can move the work around, and we'll see which teams get the most cards to done here in 15 minutes. I'll kick off these breakouts. Be sure to grab the link real quick from chat for whoever's going to be driving for your breakout. I don't think the chat stays once we do the breakout room, so just grab that link in case you're the lucky driver of your Kanban board.
Just waiting for the errors.
That was awesome. So I took some time to jump around and I was listening in and being creepy with everybody. But one of the things I always love about this game, and I know that didn't give you much time to really get into the meat of it or look at even any of the metrics that I was gathering, but you have access to that link if you want to try it again or play it with your team. But one of my favorite parts about the game is listening to the conversations everyone has around how to organize around the work. And what's so interesting is that's really what our stand-ups are for, right? And very often they end up being very statusy, where I could tell you the same, I could say the same thing every day this week that I'm working on, and it might not even be on the board. It becomes really hard for us to keep track of the work that we're doing. And so if you take nothing out of today other than this is something I feel like you can put into practice immediately with your teams. And I usually run stand-up like this with Scrum teams too. So walking the board from right to left and having conversations like you just had with the game. How old is this work? How much work is left? So while the boxes on the tickets aren't necessarily part of a Kanban system, they helped you guys have a conversation around how much work was remaining. And one of the quotes I heard from one group was, if this one has so many more boxes than the other one, why wouldn't we put 2 people on it to get it done sooner? Right. And so starting to think about how can you take some of this into your conversations with your team so that every stand-up is an opportunity to reorganize around the work. Some other things I heard whip age. So looking at how old the tickets were, how close was it to being done. I saw a couple teams that had more than one blocker. And what's always so interesting about the blockers is the more work you pull in, the more chances you have of that work getting blocked, right? And so if you play this into more days of the game, you'll start to see a lot more hot pink stickies show up on your board, because the more work you're doing, the more stuff that can get stuck in the system. So by keeping our overall system work in progress limits low, we have less stuff that gets blocked. And then I heard everyone talking about capacity, right? So the capacity in the game is moving the little minions around to the cards to say, here's where they each should be contributing. But think about how you can take this back and do this with your team. I had one team that I worked with that was really struggling with what we were referring to as ticket squatting. So pulling work in and assigning it to myself, even though I might have 5 items on the board. I clearly wasn't working on all of those things, but I kept pulling stuff out and, putting my name on it. And so one of the things we did is we took all the assignees off the tickets. So at stand up, we really had to have a conversation around what was needed, who had capacity, but no one put their name on a ticket anymore, so that we could be really fluid and responsive in organizing around who had capacity to do the work. Kind of a fun experiment. So let's go
Colleen,
through.
do you mind if I jump in and just add just a story?
Yeah.
So one thing you could do too, if you have like some kind of like maybe big change you want to put inside of your system, like, hey, maybe we should have half our total whip limits across all of our teams should be half of what we have for people. And people are like, oh my gosh, that'd be crazy. How could we do that? Maybe you simulate it and say, well, what's the effect of that? And then you actually look at the analytics and say, wow, it looks pretty good. Or this is what it would feel like. And you maybe can get people a little bit more comfortable with some idea like that. If you're trying something kind of,
Yeah, I'm a big fan of giving the team a lot of autonomy to try things too, even though it might not always be the things I would recommend. Like I've had teams kind of do the opposite of what Jeff just described too, and say, we want to be able to have 2 things per person or 3 things per person. And, I usually try to position it as like, what impact do we think that will have on our cycle time and our throughput? Let's try it. Let's try it for 2 weeks and see how it works out. Because I think that's the best way for a team to learn, is to feel it, even though I probably wouldn't recommend that they start with 3 items per person. It's a good way to figure it out pretty quickly. So I like that. I like that approach a lot. What you're looking at here is the cycle time scatter plot, and JIRA does spit one of these out, although I don't think it gives you the percentiles in the same way as this view that we're looking at from Actionable Agile. And one of the things that is awesome about this chart is it starts to give us that visualization of the pattern of how long it's taking us to complete work items. Each item on here is one ticket that's been completed and how many days it took to complete it. And so as a team, we can start to use this data to help improve our process. I usually pull this up in retros and we'll click through some of these ones that are over this 85% line to say, looks like anything above the 85% line took us 20 days or more. What could we have done differently with these tickets so that we could have tried to move them through? And in some cases, it's not, there's nothing that could have been done. In other cases, it's like, how could we have escalated this earlier? Maybe responded to the indicators that this was aging beyond our point of comfort. And we'll close out here talking about Little's Law. And so Little's Law tells us that our average cycle time is roughly equal to average WIP over average throughput. And while this isn't an equation that you can plug in these numbers and figure out what your ideal WIP should be, what's important to see here is that as a team, the lever we have to pull is our WIP. And so if we're trying to, like Jeff said, experiment with getting an ideal cycle time and throughput, WIP becomes the lever that the team has to pull to do that. And predictability becomes important here. So if our WIP goes up 1 week to 10 items and then down to 2 and up to 5 and, and is constantly moving, cycle time and throughput will follow that. So when you start to see on that scatter plot view that we were just looking at a lot of dots all over the place, I usually would go look at your WIP run chart to see, did your work in progress follow that same jumping around, because it's likely that is also changing. I know we're coming up on time here, and I mentioned that I would cover briefly a little bit of how this gets used for forecasting and then encourage everyone to go take our new applied metrics class. But when we talk about forecasting, and I'll do this as a story too, if I asked everybody on this call, how long would it take to paint your bathroom? You might tell me, I don't know, there's probably 2 days, there's 4 walls and one's a shower and one's a door. And I say, okay, great, go paint your bathroom. And when you get in there to paint the bathroom, you have to tape all the little corners around the tub and take the shower curtain down and take the medicine cabinet off the wall. And so this turns into a 4-day project. The same thing happens when we go ask our developers, how long will this thing take? They're thinking about their part, hands on keyboards, or rolling the paint on the wall being the estimate that they give us. They're often not thinking about packaging and deploying and all the time that the code or the story sits in between all these phases, right? And so what we start to do is we gather this data, we use this data for forecasting because it's based on real work, and all of that stuff that's hard to account for gets rolled into that number. When you first start reviewing these metrics with your team, I feel like every team is like, that can't be right. It doesn't take us that long. That number is so high. And what we often find is that all that time that work is sitting waiting between different stages of the board is what drives that number way up. And when we look at how we can optimize our boards and how we can start to get better delivery and get faster, a lot of that optimization really comes from the process. It's not making anybody on your team work faster, it's eliminating all those places where work is stuck. So that is, I'm gonna jump down. Our final Kanban saying here, stop starting, start finishing. Hopefully everyone's heard this one. I want to open it up and see if anyone has any questions.
Hello, Johnson. Thank you for the presentation. That was wonderful. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
That was wonderful. I got a couple of questions for you. Number one question is, who is responsible for implementing Kanban? For example, in the manufacturing factory, who is responsible for implementing Kanban? Is it the supervisor or the manager? Or who is responsible, actually, you tell me? Then another one is, that is number one. Number two is, how do we implement Kanban in, say, in a manufacturing company? let's say manufacturing coatings, for example, how do we implement it actually?
Yeah.
That's number 2. Then number 3 is you show the kind of scatter plots, and the other one also you showed a slide that's a kind of as if the process is automated or something. How do you automate this Kanban process? So that's it.
Great questions. So in terms of kicking off Kanban for any team or organization, I always like to, it's just like any change, whether it's Scrum, Kanban, any change you're bringing to the team, you're always going to be more successful if the team understands why. I think I've been brought in many organizations where it's a top down, like we're asking from a manager or director that says, switch all these teams to Kanban. And there's a very strong resistance to that, I think, without a connection to kind of what's in it for us. Why do we need to change the way we're working? You'll hear people say, I think there's a misconception that Kanban is looser than, there's no rules and you can work on things forever and there's no discipline. And in a lot of ways, I think there's more discipline required from the team in Kanban to be looking at all of those different data points and having a plan for how to respond to the information about their work. And without that, I think if the team's not bought into it, it's just not going to work. And so one of the things I like to do when I kick things off for a new Kanban team is do a little survey about what things they feel like are working or not working and how they deliver, so that I can make sure I'm addressing the stuff that feels broken for them. And is it wait times? Is it dependencies? Is it cross-team dependencies on different departments, and what are the things that we can help use their Kanban system to help address those concerns? Because otherwise it feels like someone's telling them what to do without really connecting the why. So I think that's an important part of that. Remind me, Isaiah, what was number 2?
Number 2, who is responsible for implementing it? Is it the supervisor or manager?
I would say it's the team more than anything. There's no really specific roles in Kanban. So there's no prescribed Scrum Master role, although, I think there's a lot of value to having somebody play that role similar to a Scrum Master who helps oversee the process, pull data. I had a team I worked with that referred to the role as the Jiminy Cricket of the team, the conscience of the team. So they rotated that role through the team and took turns being the Jiminy Cricket for the team and helping the team kind of say, this is the stuff, this is what we said we would do if our work aged, and how are we going to hold ourselves accountable to that?
Okay, so how do we automate Kanban?
How do we automate?
Yeah.
So do you mean if there's parts of the workflow that require automation?
I don't know. I'm seeing some scatter plots, some stuff like that. How do we get that?
Yeah, so Actionable Agile is a great place to start. Jira does have some tools built into it that you can use.
Actionable?
Jira will. Jira has a scatter plot. There are also, if you go onto the Actionable Agile site, you can look at their plugin for Jira. That's usually what I recommend if you're using Jira. I'm also a big fan of Kanbanize. If you are open to new tool suggestions, it has all of the metrics built in and just a really nice setup if all of the teams are using Kanban. I don't find that very often. Usually it's kind of a hybrid of some teams are Kanban, some teams are Scrum, and that's where Jira, I think, works best.
Okay, so these are Kanban tools, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, how about Andre?
Yeah.
Thank you for taking my question, Colleen. So I also have kind of 2 questions. I think they are linked. It's about, you were talking about lead time. So that is the time that work spends within the team. So the developers start working on it, and we check how long that then takes to complete. Now, my question is more around, so there's things that happen before. So business or someone asks for something, and then it lands on the backlog. There's time that lapses there. How do you account for that? Because that is, so there's an expectation management that needs to happen. Because I asked for something. Now, if you tell me your lead time is X, it doesn't really make sense to me because I don't know how long it will take you to actually start working on that thing. So that's the one question. In the other question, I don't know, I don't think, well, on second thought, it might not be linked. It is, in which other areas than IT have you implemented Kanban?
Yeah, so your first question is great. So typically the difference of what you just described is lead time versus cycle time. And so lead time is measured from when it hits the backlog, when it hits the queue, or when the request is filed. And that's a super important metric for teams like customer support or help desk or even IT operations teams where they're serving kind of external customers. Because like you said, when I file the ticket, that's when the clock starts for me. I want to know when my thing's done, and it doesn't matter to me when you start it. Cycle time is usually measured from when it hits in progress to when it's done. And so that would be the team's metric, right, of how long this work item takes us to complete. The difference between those can be super important, like you said, to help you understand how well you're managing your backlog. So looking at things like work item age on work coming into that first column on your board is just as important as it is for active work. And so coming up with different ways where you're going to review work, the age of items in your backlog can be nice. From a Kanban perspective, there's not really a backlog in the sense that it's a prioritized backlog like we have in Scrum. So I would say one of the other differences there is you tend to have options, like the game called it, right? It's like a bucket of things you could work on, but it's not in priority order. And then your first column on your board is your bounded queue. So your to-do column might have a WIP limit of roughly equal to a week's worth of throughput. So you might say our to-do column has a WIP of 4, and then I have this bucket of options. And so that way too, you're able to say that helps you manage the work that's aging in the backlog further to the left. So you're pulling those things over, and that's kind of your contract back to the business for how long things will take your team to deliver. From an implementation standpoint, I mentioned security seems to be the hotspot for me lately. A lot of security teams. I've worked with marketing. This works well for marketing because it's very pull-based, right? And responsive to what's happening upstream, and that can be upstream in like dev teams. My favorite place to work is portfolio Kanban. So looking at like, what's our process for breaking down epics and creating some visibility into how how you take big things, big ideas, and validate those and bring them down to the team. And I think that's a great place for executives and senior leadership to start to see the impacts of decisions and how close something is to finishing before we start something new. So I think portfolio is a great place as well. I did an HR board once that was kind of fun. We had like a recruiting pipeline that was visible in the whole company, so you could see where different candidates were for different jobs. That was kind of a fun one too.
Oh, thank you, Colleen.
Yeah.
Done it with marketing teams as well. I've done it with operations, infrastructure teams, app dev teams. I mean, it can be used everywhere. HR teams, like just like Colleen. So it's applicable in so many spaces.
Yeah.
I'm using Kanban for my son.
Yeah.
For his schoolwork.
Agile at home.
I know, I've just moved the board out of my background. Our kids have a big board behind me that is their summer board. All the stuff has to move to done before they can have screens.
Any other questions? Let me check.
So somebody saying, Andre said he was using Kanban for his kid, right? How is that possible? Actually?
So he's got schoolwork to do. We're doing homeschooling with COVID now. So schools in South Africa are closed and kids have to be at home, but schools are continuing, or some of the schools are continuing. So we have a Kanban board where we make his work for the day visible, and he pulls tickets as to what he has in progress and what he has done for the day.
Okay, thank you.
So I found a use for my stickies.
Okay. Thank you.
So I don't put Kanban board at home because else my to-do list is too huge. So I prefer not to put a Kanban board.
That's where you don't want it visible. It's more stressful to see it.
Too visible.
I see one other question in the chat around the differences between what are the fundamental differences between Scrum and Kanban. And Is Kanban good for complex projects? These are great questions. And really, when we think about the differences between Scrum and Kanban, they both have constraints, right? In Scrum, your constraint is your sprint and your time box. And in Kanban, your constraint is your work in progress limits. And so both require thinking about what is going to be the best fit. I think Kanban works well for projects or for teams with a lot of unplanned work that comes to them, but it works just as well for, you know, software development where you're running a project, right? One of the things that I always say is that both practices, whether you go with Scrum or Kanban, really the success in my mind hinges on how well you break your work down. And I think one of the things you see pretty quickly from a Kanban perspective is if you're not breaking your work down in a way that allows value to move through the system independently, it will fall apart. And you end up with like a log jam of dependencies or, you know, all these subtasks that can't be tested together and can't move through your board. I think with both Scrum and Kanban, there's some fundamental work breakdown that has to be in place for either one to work well. So getting things like good vertically sliced, valuable user stories or work items that are independent.
Hello, Colleen. I have issues. Actually, I think this is my first time for attending Kanban classes. So I'm so sorry if I access stuff that are too basics or something. Can you explain again this? Already you've been emphasizing on WIP, so I understand that properly. This throughput, I don't understand that properly. This work item age, I don't understand it properly. And cycle time. Can you just give me a quick overview of the stuff?
Yeah, so when we think about the WIP, it doesn't matter if the item is big or small. It still counts as the same slot on our board. So whether that work item we pull in is 2 hours or 2 days, our goal is still to focus on getting that one item all the way to done. In Kanban, we refer to pulling the work in as right sizing it. And that's an important distinction. It's not same sizing the work. So the work doesn't have to all be fit to 2 days, because what often happens when a team tries to same size their work items is you end up carving them up in a way where they can't move through the system independently. And then we end up with dependencies on the work and blockers. So we want to focus on, is this work the smallest piece of value that can move through the system? And always coming back to, is it small and independently valuable so that it's not going to create that log jam of dependencies. When we talk about work item age, it's just going to be how long has it been in the board. So how, you know, if I pulled it in yesterday, it would be 2 days old. We include weekends in there as well, so that we're always looking at raw calendar days when we talk about how long something's either been in progress or the total cycle time. And that cycle time number is just once it's completed, how long did it take us?
Okay. Thank you.
I see another question in
so
here.
Basically,
go ahead.
Basically, to start using Kanban, you have to divide your board into 4 parts or something, and then start putting stickers. Is it?
No, I think the first thing you would want to do is look at all of the different work that comes to your team and look at what activities take place for us to complete this work. So your board might be 2 columns, it could be 5 columns, it could change, right? You could start with 5 and end with 3 in a couple months. But your goal is to build out a workflow that fits the activities for the work that your team does. So it might look completely different than another team.
Okay. So the stages, does this have to do with workflow? The workflow stages, does it have to do with it? For example, yeah. if I take 4 steps or 5 steps to complete a line of work, then maybe let me say raw material arrival, raw material approval, testing, maybe stuff like that. Does it have to reflect those stuffs?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it doesn't always, you know, if it shouldn't be a separate column, we can also, we talk about the activities that take place in each column as workflow policies. So it's almost like, what are the activities that always take place when it's in the development column? So sometimes you can have things that are either exit policies for that column or a separate column. And that's something that every team kind of has to play with in terms of what's the most important visible information you need to be able to get from this board. I need to know it's in code review, or can code review be part of a development activity?
I think, Colleen, we have a few more questions in the chat. Maybe we can have a quick look at this before we end.
Yeah.
So can a team use both Kanban and Scrum? For example, unplanned work, support tickets use Kanban, and Scrum for projects change requests.
Yes, Scrum and Kanban actually work super well together, and I find in a bigger organization too, where you have a mix of some teams using Scrum and Kanban, you kind of end up with this 2-week cadence to your Kanban flow, and that's really what you start to look at here. When you think about merging some of these practices together, it's really, I think it comes into planning in a slightly different way. So you're not necessarily batching work, but you're looking at that continuous flow of work coming into the team, and then still doing certain activities on a regular cadence, like backlog grooming or demos, retrospectives. All of those can still happen on a 2-week cadence. And like I said, for organizations where there's a lot of teams with different models, I see that very frequently. And then I think the other part there, if we're passing things back and forth between Kanban and Scrum, is the metrics. So these are all the metrics that we talked about for flow metrics are things I always use with Scrum teams too. So looking at how much work do we have, even thinking about how do we pull work in from our sprint in a way where we're focusing, like if we think we can do 10 stories, how are we focusing on getting those stories to done before we start the next story, so that we might end up with 8 of 10 complete instead of 80% of 10 stories completed. So we're trying to look at some of the same practices of focusing on getting things to done and evening out the flow of work within the team.
Great, thank you, Colleen. A comment and question from Bala. So, hi, Colleen, great presentation. When would you decide adding more team members? When the work is aged or it's not progressing?
Yeah, so adding more team members is a great question. There is no specific size for a Kanban team. So you can have huge Kanban teams, you can have very small Kanban teams, and you would manage that through your work in progress limits. So we would look at we would move our work in progress limits up or down based on the capacity of the team. Typically, we want all of the work for a team in one place. So one of the like if we have Scrum smells, a Kanban smell would be that I often see shared resources who have work on 3 different boards. And so that happens a lot for like UX folks or DevOps folks, where they might support 3 different teams and they have work in 3 different places. And so what we are trying to do is get all of that work visible in one place, so that if Danusha's team is blocked by me, but Jeff has also made a request of me, you can see that I'm working on Danusha's request first, and that's visible on your board too. So the work we want all of the work that everyone is doing visible in one place.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, 2 more questions. Hello, doesn't WIP limits tend to slow down the flow?
Good question. No, it doesn't. It actually tends to speed things up. It helps us, it does seem counterintuitive to how we usually work. And there is a really great book called Making Work Visible by Dominica de Grandis. I highly recommend it if you're interested in Kanban. And in it, she talks about the things that steal our time, right? I mentioned it's not often when we're trying to improve our cycle time, those efficiencies rarely come from working faster. It's looking at how do we improve our workflow and the stages that the work moves through to create some action around stuff that gets stuck. So when we think about these WIP limits, the constraint that we're putting in place in our system is forcing us to have those conversations to bring visibility into those blockers, and for us to be constantly looking at how do we rearrange our capacity towards getting that stuff done. So it tends to improve your flow.
Great, thank you. One last question from Zaire. Great presentation and very engaging, thanks. Will the game link remain active after the session? It's interesting to play on the different scenario.
Yes, you can play that game anytime. You can change your WIP limits. So you can move your WIP limits up or down. And if you click on that settings gear, there's a few things in there that are good to turn on for playing it as well that will enforce your WIP limits. It will require you to use everyone on your team to the full capacity. So there's some fun things in there you can play around with too. You can maximize your WIP. So there's things in there to try out as well. You can reset it and play it over and over. And then you'll also see a button on the game that says, analytics, and that will take you into the actionable analytics plugin for the game. So you can look at the metrics for the work that you've completed in the game.
Great, thank you, Colleen. Any other questions? I think this is the last question that we had in the chat. Anyone has any other question? Or else it's okay. Nope, I think it's okay.
Oh, we have one last. Who plays the role of Kanban?
Okay, the question just arrived. Who plays the role of Kanban? PM or Scrum Master?
Well, as much as possible, hopefully the whole team. So your goal here is really that the team is working together to make decisions. If you have a Scrum Master on your team, I would absolutely keep them on your team, and they will help you with your process, facilitation of stand-ups, retrospectives, looking at all of the metrics that we talked about. I've also seen engineering managers play that role. But it's really just going to depend on the existing makeup of your team. You wouldn't really change the way your team is made up to fit this, but it's always nice to have an internal champion, even if it's a team member, right? There's no requirement that there's a Scrum Master or an engineering manager leading it.
Thank you, Colleen. I think that was the last one, so that's great. Any last words, Colleen, before we wrap up?
That's everything I have. If you'd like to learn more about Kanban, check out prokanban.org, and you will find a Kanban guide on the site that will give you kind of a good starting point for putting any of this into practice with your team. And I'd love to hear, if any of you start to implement Kanban with your teams or want to test it out with your kids, that's a great safe place to try it too, the homework Kanban. So let me know. I mean, I'd love to hear your stories too of how you've tried it or what you're interested in experimenting with your teams.
Great. Thank you, Colleen, for making the time to share with our small community about the basics of Kanban. It was very insightful, definitely, and very nice simulation game. And thank you, everyone, for being with us today. And as a reminder, please feel free to follow us on our various channels. I've posted it in the chat window. And definitely, we value your feedback. And we appreciate if you could send same to us via these channels or contact us via LinkedIn. And stay tuned, some cool stuffs are in the oven for our next sessions. And I wish you all a very nice evening and a nice day to some of you who are abroad. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.